Okay, so this lecture is on capitalism and economic liberty. What is capitalism? Capitalism is a much debated word. Uh, it's both debated in its consequences and effect, but even more so on its definition. So it's important for us to get at least a neutral definition of what capitalism is before we go on and try to figure out what its implications are. Capitalism at its base is a combination of two things. Private property rights, particularly in the means of production, so in productive assets like land or factories, as well as labor, coupled with the idea of economic liberty. And economic liberty here simply means the freedom to do with that private property more or less as you wish, at least limited by the equal freedom of others to do with their private property what they wish. So that will imply things like freedom of contract. So, as I said, economic liberty, the liberty to do what one wishes with one's property without external interference, especially with respect to voluntary contract with others in exchanges of goods and services. Now, economic liberty, because of confusions about or confusions or misunderstandings or simply disagreements about what liberty and freedom means, sometimes economic liberty is used in different contexts and in ways which is not consistent with the basic definition of capitalism. So economic liberty, at least in this context, is not the freedom from economic want. So it's not the freedom from economic need. It's not economic power. It's not the capacity to do a whole lot with your economic liberty. So it's not positive liberty. It's primarily negative liberty. And it's not a wide range of economic options necessarily. Right, so if I am free, it's not necessarily the case that I have many options to select from. It's merely the case that I am the one who gets to select between whatever options I have. Now, it's true that freedom, that prosperity, some degree of economic power, and some range of economic options is often thought to follow from the presence of economic liberty. But that is something that's that there's much dispute about, and that's something that still needs to be worked out. It's not definitional that these things follow. It's empirical, it's statistical. It's a question of how things play out in actual societies. Now, why does Milton Friedman think economic liberty is so important? He gives us at least three reasons. It helps separate economic and political power. So, if it is the case that a wide range of economic actors in society are free from the interference of others to make choices about the assets that they control, what that means is that a centralized government or an economic elite is not the one making those decisions. And so it helps separate economic and political power in society, and for Milton Friedman, that's one of the hallmarks of a free society. It also helps exercise other liberties. So if I have some assets on which to fall back, and if I have property that I can use, it enables me to be free in other ways, to pursue projects, for example. Or it helps establish my political liberty to the extent that I can use my property to do things like organize a political rally, or if I have money, then I can use that to print pamphlets, and so on and so forth. So it gives me some standing. I don't have to have permission for anyone for holding an economic rally on my property. If I'm renting, that might not be true. Similarly, if I don't have a lot of money, then I don't have a lot of means with which to pursue political activity. And so the freedom to use my resources for my own purposes widens the scope of my liberty in general, not just my economic liberty. And finally, Milton Friedman does think that economic liberty helps give people choices over their lives. Choices, if these are my resources, then I may put them to whatever objectives I find congenial. I don't have to answer to other people. Again, this is the notion of choice, which is strongly supported by the notion of economic liberty for Milton Friedman. Debates about capitalism are usually debates about its effects, though. The effect of combining wide-ranging economic liberty with relatively strong property rights. There are some foreseeable problems with this sort of system, and these are problems that are acknowledged by anybody trying to defend capitalism, including Milton Friedman. One, the possibility of natural monopolies arising. What that means is roughly that the nature of certain kinds of goods is such that even in a competitive market, it will tend to be the case that one provider will end up winning out and supplying all of the good. This is true particularly for the sorts of products that require massive economies of scale. That is to say, the cost of producing it goes down the bigger the producer is. Think of electricity, or water utilities, or even telecommunications to some degree. The more people you have on a network, the lower the cost per person to have on that network is. And so, generally speaking, you see natural monopolies arising with those sorts of goods and services, and of course monopolies are non-competitive, and because they're non-competitive they don't tend to serve consumers very well. So there is a tendency for that to be a problem for if you allow private property rights in utilities, in I think electricity and water, maybe roads are good examples where natural monopolies will tend to arise because of the feature of the good itself, and that makes competition more difficult. Neighborhood effects and externalities to production are a second major problem that's acknowledged by anybody defending capitalism. The idea is that capitalism works relatively well when property rights are well defined, but when people are able to externalize the costs of their action, property is a fantastic device for internalizing costs. That is to say that if I get the benefits and I reap the costs of my use of property, I generally have a good incentive to be efficient, to be careful with my use of property. On the other hand, if I can externalize the cost of using my property, for instance, if I have a factory and I can pollute into the environment and decrease the value of other people's property, say downstream from my factory if I'm polluting the water, or downwind from my factory if it's air pollution, I can sometimes externalize the costs of my behavior on others. And because it would be expensive for people to sue me, because harms are sometimes hard to figure out, those kinds of externalities sometimes go unremedied in capitalist systems. So because property rights are never going to be fully well defined, and it's never completely clear, at least in certain kinds of violations of property rights occur, you get these neighborhood externalities which can add up to things like global warming on a massive scale, and it's not clear how a full-blooded capitalist system can deal with these sorts of neighborhood effects. And finally, and this is a problem potentially for destabilizing societies and managing people's expectations within capitalist societies, is that capitalist societies, for all their productive genius, tend to produce quite large inequalities of income and wealth over time. What this does is over time perhaps reduce the dynamism of the system by restricting opportunities to only those who are well connected and who have benefited from favorable circumstances, and so over time capitalist systems may be self-undermining in some ways, or just may tend towards social unrest as people start expecting a whole lot because they see a whole lot of wealth being created, but only ever a small fraction of the people can really achieve the kinds of wealth that are on display, and this creates a mismatch between expectations and reality, which can be socially destabilizing. So these are all reasons that are more or less acknowledged by defenders of capitalism, and for which they have to have a response. Now, in addition to these, there are accusations leveled at capitalism that its apologists tend to resist. Some of these are going to be Marxist, and you'll recognize them. So, for instance, there's an association of capitalism with imperialism and the need to secure expanded and protected markets for domestic manufacturers. There's the idea that concentrations of economic wealth and income inevitably lead to the corruption of democracy, not just the corruption of capitalism, but the corruption of democracy, and therefore that capitalism inevitably leads to something like corporatism or fascism. There's the idea that competition inevitably leads to monopoly or oligopoly, that all markets favor business. I said that capitalists acknowledge that some markets favor big businesses, certain kinds of products, but some people think that it's more than that, it's all products. There's the idea that commodification of human life is either necessary or necessarily harmful under capitalism. So the idea is that under capitalism, because so much is for sale and up for grabs, so to speak, is that everything might be up for sale under capitalism. And the worry is that, of course, some things might ought not to be up for sale. There's also the idea that capitalism leads to the increased immiseration of the working class, right? This is a very Marxist sort of critique of capitalism, which says that over time, the working class gets poorer and poorer under capitalism due to competitive pressures, right? So it's not just product markets that are competitive under capitalism, it's labor markets, right? So workers are competing against one another, and to the extent that that produces a downward pressure on prices, in this case the price of labor, competition in the labor markets will tend to make the poor get poorer, according to Marxists. Capitalists, of course, resist this and point to the fact that wages are often a result of marginal productivity. So there is a downward pressure on wages, but there's also an upward pressure on wages to the extent that particularly skilled labor is necessary to the operation of most capitalist businesses. And indeed, those wages are bid up rather than bid down. Okay, there's also the idea that capitalism requires patriarchal gender relations within the family in order to function. So in some sense, capitalism requires the oppression of women for the system to work. And finally, the idea that pure capitalism at the end of the day is unregulated anarchy, right? That if we take capitalism to its logical extreme, it becomes a system that admits of no public control whatsoever and descends into a kind of anarchy, a very unattractive sort of situation. Look, it would take a very long time to debate all of these questions, but let's look at the last one. Does pure capitalism imply statelessness? Well, I think the idea, of course, the answer depends on what you mean by pure capitalism. I think most apologists for capitalism recognize that preserving economic liberty and private property requires some non-market institutions. It's not the case that everything has to be a market institution. There's going to be certain kinds of political institutions that markets can't supply on their own, or if they do, they can't sustain them on their own. So in that sense, capitalism is going to depend on a political infrastructure that defends property rights from theft or fraud, as well as other forms of private coercion that would interfere with economic liberty. So in order to defend capitalism, you have to defend a state that is, in some sense, pro-market and pro-economic freedom somehow. Now, a lot of consequentialists prefer to defend competition rather than capitalism. Most of the good consequences, they say, for consumers and employees of capitalist systems come about because of the use of economic competition between firms to produce the best products for consumers and hire the best employees to produce these products or services. So the fact that producers are competing for workers bids up their wages, and the fact that they're competing for business of consumers tends to bid down prices, and all of these things are very good things. In some sense, capitalism imposes a very harsh discipline on firms. If firms do not serve their customers very well, they will probably go out of business in time. And to the extent that a business treats its workers poorly, then over time its workers will tend to leave and join other businesses who will hopefully treat them better. And so to the extent that these competitive pressures can improve the behavior of businesses over and above what they might be otherwise, then capitalism does quite a little bit of good, consequentially speaking. Now, it's true that many defenders of capitalism assume that a system of private property and economic liberty is sufficient to create competition, that the only thing needed to create competition is to remove barriers that are imposed on competition by the state. But of course, that's not necessarily obvious. There might be, like we mentioned with national monopolies, certain situations where competition does not arise merely by removing barriers to trade, right? Merely by establishing private property rights. After all, you might argue that at least at some times in history, we've had private property rights and relative absence of barriers to trade, and people have not traded. So it's possible that something more is needed. What that thing is, whether it's cultural or whether it's some other forms of political institutions to encourage competition and to encourage trade, I don't know. We come back to this sort of age-old debate between consequentialism and deontology in defenses of capitalism, right? defenses of private property and economic liberty can be made both on deontological and consequentialist grounds. I already sketched out some of those consequentialist ones just now. Consequentialist capitalists are likely to have what I call GR accounts of property, general rights accounts of property. And they defend economic liberty insofar as it yields a competitive economy. Right, so restrictions on property and economic liberty for consequentialists are unproblematic as long as they yield benefits greater than their costs. But consequentialist defenders of capitalism just don't feel that those restrictions are generally warranted. The benefits accrued are just often not worth the cost. It looks like you might get some benefits, but in reality, the costs outweigh them. Now, those consequentialist critics of capitalism, of course, don't share their views on the benefits of markets or on the likelihood of economic liberty and private property yielding competitive market conditions. Now, this debate in principle can be settled empirically. Let's have a look at what happens when we have relatively capitalist economic institutions versus other sorts of institutions. I think the historical record is fairly clear that at least some measure of private property and competition has been hugely beneficial to lifting people out of poverty, if you look at take the long view of history. Note that those who find economic liberty and property rights to be distasteful on deontological grounds, so for instance they find them wrong per se, if you will, can resist capitalism while admitting their ability to generate wealth. So the fact that capitalism can generate a lot of wealth will not be significant to them to the extent that capitalist relations of either private property or free contract are morally objectionable in other ways. There's a pretty large literature out there full of folks who bemoan capitalism and the sorts of relationships that it fosters between people, but acknowledge its remarkable ability to produce wealth. And a lot of people willing to tolerate capitalism for that reason, not because they find anything particularly admirable in the notions of voluntary trade and private property, but because they respect its ability to discipline people's behavior, and in particular its ability to produce a remarkable amount of innovation and productivity. Now, deontological capitalists are of a different sort. They endorse private property and economic liberty because these are a uniquely appropriate way of respecting human dignity or autonomy, right? Note the difference in the sorts of arguments. Here, deontological capitalists are going to say that private property is a particularly good thing, and economic liberty is a particularly appropriate way of respecting our right to make choices, particularly economic choices, about how we live, work, and so on and so forth. These folks usually have special rights accounts of private property. Private property arises from special interactions that people forge with private property. So for instance, if I work on something, I forge a bond to that. And that bond is morally worthy of respect by other people. Other people may not steal the products of my labor. So if I create a song, for example, it becomes my song. Right? I take words that are out there that anybody could have used, and I make it into my song. I put it to sheet music, and it becomes, in some sense, mine through my creative efforts. I have a special link to that song, and anybody who tries to profit from that song or play it without my permission, perhaps, would be doing something wrong. Right, regardless of what the law says, regardless of whether the law permits people to, sample other people's work for free or what have you, you might argue that somebody needs that respecting people's contributions requires, in some sense, respecting them. That would be a special rights account of private property. Now, on these sorts of views, restrictions on economic liberty, restrictions on the freedom to contract, or restrictions on what you can do with your private property are always going to be morally problematic. They always involve infringing on people's liberty, even if those restrictions are there for the greater good for some reason. Now, those who are deontological critics of capitalism, of course, argue the opposite. They say that, in fact, allowing people to truck, barter, and trade is not particularly reflective of their human dignity, that these are not the choices that really matter, that if anything, those choices may in fact be more narrowed by capitalism, particularly the sorts that produce a great amount of inequality. And so if capitalism leaves people open to exploitation and abuse, then capitalism is in fact not morally superior than other sorts of systems we might imagine. Again, this is a deontological debate that occurs in parallel, but also completely distinctly from the consequentialist debate about the effects of capitalism and private property. Okay, so that's my quick introduction to capitalism. As always, if you have any questions, you know how to reach me.